thunderstorm split the night, and the little girl woke up afraid. And with the next lightning flash, she called out for her mother, and in moments, Mother was sitting on the edge of the bed. "Little one, you don't need to be afraid," she said. "You know God is here with you." "Yeah," the little girl answered, "but tonight I need somebody with skin on." The author and essayist Marilynne Robinson had a recent essay in the New York Times, and it was based on two observations. First, she says, contemporary America is full of fear. Now, you and I could fill in a lot of blanks if we were asked what she might mean, because American life just seems to be overshadowed with fear-darkened clouds. Fear of terrorist attacks, accompanied by fearful attitudes toward Muslims. Fear of African Americans and all non-whites. Mexicans, refugees, undocumented immigrants, an America that looks very different from the one we grew up in. Gangs and drug addicts, those who it's claimed would steal away American jobs. For some, fear of police, fear of nuclear war, of climate change, and guns, and more guns. Deep fear in a society isn't new, and neither is the manipulation of fear by people who have power to do so, layering onto our fears and exploiting them so they can help themselves to more power by hardening our fear into anger, dividing us further, promising the good life for some, surrounded by a very big wall. We're living in days when the exploitation of America's fear has been raised to new heights and fanned by new media. But here's the second of Marilynne Robinson's two observations. Fear is not a Christian habit of mind. Wow, this one I think is a much bigger challenge for our understanding. Sure, our scriptures tell us that through the voices of psalmists and angels and apostles and Jesus himself, to be unafraid as we walk through the complicatedness of this world, storm clouds and all, that our God is bigger than anything that can threaten us, body and soul. But are these now just words on pages? Can they be real for us? I've always been intrigued and puzzled by that verse I read a bit ago from the first letter of John, which is typically translated, "Perfect love casts out fear." For one thing, it's a very inviting statement. And for another thing, it speaks first not about courage, bravery, guts as the antidote to fear. It speaks of love. Now, I wish we knew more of the details about the writer of this statement and this letter, who he or she was, where he or she lived, what his or her community was actually living through, what led to this affirming claim about love and fear. Then we could walk through how to translate that directly or indirectly into our own experience today of fear and love. But we can say very little about the writer, where and why the letter was written. We're pretty sure that this is not John, the beloved disciple of Jesus. It's possible that it's the author of the Gospel of John, but scholars say it's more likely someone else who shared in that same school of thought of the teachings of Jesus. As an elder, this letter writer may have had responsibilities for guiding several churches in the region. And this letter, along with John's second and third letters, was likely written very late in the first century. But what's more important for us is that the community was under some sort of threat, including controversy about who Jesus was. We know this because John has some strong words toward false teachings. Yes, it's tempted to call them fake news today, but I'll refrain from that. Also strong words for the teachers who are teaching them. And he exhorts his readers in the churches to hold on to what John understands as the core confession about Jesus. Without much detail, it seems that these false teachings claim that Jesus' divinity only appeared to also include humanity. That Jesus only actually looked human. That in Jesus, God had a fleshless relationship with our world. That God and Jesus are spirit only. And if that was so, why should Jesus' followers care about anything except the inner spiritual life? Why care about this world and all its flawed creatures? For John, the core of the Christian confession includes a Jesus with skin on, to quote our earlier story. In Jesus, divinity met humanity, flesh and blood, a skinful relationship. It was both a spiritual and physical love affair with our world. And still is, says our theology. So we too are called to love all of this world in spirit and in body, John claims, as God so loved it. And God shows us in Jesus where that love can come from. No, we can't just manufacture it on our own, nor are we expected to be able to do so. Not this kind of love. Jesus' life reveals that this love we are to have, agape in Greek, comes ultimately from God, which is why John can write that if we really have love for one another, that's God alive in us. If we don't, we can't make that claim. If we do, God's love is being perfected in us. But there's that word perfect again. Yikes. We've probably never thought of perfect as an option for ourselves. Didn't we confess not long ago this morning how imperfect we are? And there's something very burden-lifting about confessing to our forgiving God. And as somebody once said, the one good thing about my being so imperfect is the joy it seems to bring to others. But John and the other biblical authors are talking about something different from our understanding of perfection. Perfect to us means flawless, unbroken, unstained, pedestaled, statue-like. The Greek word teleos implies something more like a wholeness of all the parts, good and bad, brought together, in this case, by the grace of God. Something like a growing up, a coming together, a maturing. And every Christian has to rely on the forgiveness, the grace, the love of God every day in order to grow. John would agree. So it is to be perfected in love, to be growing up. It's freeing, empowering to know that we depend not on our own moral rectitude, but on God. In this is love, John says. Not that we loved God, but that God loved us. And to get back to the question of our fears, yes, this is love with skin on. Jesus' love. And with this love in us, or abiding in us, as John says, we need not be afraid. Because love has the ability to crowd out fear. cast it out. At this point in his letter, John says this is why we don't need to be afraid of God's punishment, that we may have boldness on the day of judgment. But John also makes the claim that this human but God-perfected love knows no boundaries between brothers and sisters. It says this in the midst of whatever controversy his churches have going on. It says it in the midst of his world, which held some mighty punishments for Christian believers. It says the more God's love abides in us, the more fear may be pushed out. Can this echo in our ears, in our hearts, in our own days of fear? We know there's way too little love reaching across way too many divisions in our world. And Americans are in something of a crisis over what our boundaries are or should be, nationally and personally. According to the UN, every minute, 20 to 24 people in our world must leave their homes and become refugees. 24 a minute. Violence, persecution, natural disaster, roughly 50 or 60 million people, record numbers. But the United States is on track in the coming year to receive within our boundaries the smallest number of refugees since at least 1980. They cost too much, we're told. We can pay to keep them in other countries. And most of all, they might be dangerous. Does God's love abide in us? Push out the fear. Not love in spiritual sounding words, but love with skin on. Someone lately sent me an online link to a talk by a young American Muslim woman, and it's riveting. Her name is Amal Kasir, and her talk is funny and frank and even healing. She says that the shortest way to cross the distance between two people is simply asking someone's name. Because without that, we are all too quick to come up with other names. Black, white, terrorist, racist, supremacist, elitist, and on downhill from there. She knows because as Muslims, even American Muslims, she and her family have been called many things. In a culture of fear, people avoid asking one another's names. Instead, we label others with these stereotypes. But when we do the one small thing, seek someone's name, Amal says, we're crossing a boundary. Our names connect to who we are, to our families, our stories. It's the beginning step toward a real relationship, and fear begins to be squeezed out. God's love lives here. Let's deport our fear. The poster in the narthex this morning comes from the UN Refugee Agency. I hope you'll notice it on the way out. It's a picture made from overhead by the Italian Coast Guard of one of those horribly crowded boats making the dangerous crossing across the Mediterranean. It's a very striking picture because you can't look at it and think of, oh, just one more boatload of the thousands of people, because they're all looking up and we see almost every single face. Light, dark, frowning, smiling, fearful, hopeful, and behind every face is a name, a story. God's love lives here. Let's deport our fear and welcome folks in need. On this World Communion Sunday, the gospel challenges us to consider that the biggest thing we should fear is not that there might be someone among the world's needy people who might harm us. It's that we, the church, might stay silent in response to the need of all of these whose names are known to God. Amen. Our hymn